The blood-red sunset scorched the horizon as Rebecca Anderson clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, watching as the last ember of hope flickered in the dying campfire before her. She had been running for 3 days straight, and now, in the vast emptiness of the Colorado Territory, she had nowhere left to go. Rebecca's tears fell silently, each drop hissing as it struck the glowing coals. She had lost everything: her home, her family's ranch, and now possibly her freedom. The year was 1875, and the promise of a new life in the West had turned into a bitter struggle for survival. "Reckon those tears won't keep that fire alive much longer, madam." Rebecca startled, her hand instinctively reaching for the small derringer hidden in the folds of her skirt. A tall figure emerged from the darkness, his silhouette crowned by a wide-brimmed hat. As he stepped into the fading light, she could see his face weathered by sun and wind, but with eyes that held a surprising gentleness. "Stay back," she warned, her voice steadier than she felt. The stranger raised his hand slowly. "Xavier Young's my name. I don't mean you any harm, just noticed your fire from a ways off." He gestured to a chestnut stallion tethered to a juniper tree several yards away. "Was heading to Salida when I saw the smoke." "I don't need help," Rebecca lied, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Xavier lowered himself onto a flat rock across from her, keeping a respectful distance. "Maybe not. But nobody should be out here alone, especially not with what sounds like a mighty burden." The fire sputtered, nearly dead now. Rebecca stared at the embers, wondering if she could trust this stranger, wondering if she had any choice. "You've been fighting something fierce," Xavier observed quietly. "I can see it in your eyes." When she didn't respond, he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out some kindling and a few small logs. Without asking permission, he rebuilt the dying fire, his movements practiced and efficient. As the flames grew again, casting long shadows across the rocky ground, Rebecca's resolve crumbled. She had been alone too long. "She cried beside the dying fire," Xavier said softly, almost to himself. Then looking directly at her, he added, "You don't have to keep fighting alone." Something in his voice, a sincerity perhaps, or a shared understanding of solitude, broke the last of Rebecca's defenses. "They're going to hang me in Gunnison," she whispered, "for a murder I didn't commit." Xavier didn't flinch, just nodded slowly. "Then I reckon we've got some talking to do." Rebecca Anderson had arrived in Colorado Territory just 6 months earlier, traveling from Boston after receiving news of her father's death. Jonathan Anderson had moved west 5 years before, establishing a modest cattle ranch 15 miles outside of Salida. His letters spoke of hardship, but also of the stunning beauty of the Rockies and the freedom of the frontier. His death had been ruled an accident, a fall from his horse during a thunderstorm, but Rebecca had her doubts from the moment she stepped foot on the property. The ranch, which her father had described as prospering, was in disarray, and several prime acres had somehow transferred to the neighboring landowner, Vincent Holloway, a man with political connections and a reputation for ruthless business dealings. Rebecca had challenged the land transfer, presenting her father's letters and ledgers as evidence of foul play. 3 weeks ago, Holloway's foreman had been found dead on Anderson property, shot in the back. All evidence pointed to Rebecca, who had been seen arguing with him the day before. "I found him already dead," Rebecca explained, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee Xavier had prepared. "I was checking the north fence line when I discovered his body. He had my father's watch in his pocket, the one that had mysteriously disappeared after father's death." Xavier listened without interruption, occasionally adding wood to the fire. The night had grown cold, stars spreading across the vast Colorado sky like diamond dust. When I confronted Holloway about the watch, He claimed I'd killed Grady in a rage and planted the watch to frame him. Rebecca's voice trembled with indignation. The sheriff is Holloway's cousin. They gave me until morning to get my affairs in order before the trial, but there wouldn't be a trial, not a fair one. Xavier's eyes narrowed. So you ran. I had no choice. But Holloway's men were close behind me until yesterday, when I managed to lose them in Dead Man's Canyon. She gestured vaguely eastward. I was heading to Denver, hoping to find a lawyer who'd take my case, but my horse went lame this morning. I had to. Her voice broke. She'd loved that mare, raised her from a foal. Leaving her at a homestead with strangers had felt like abandoning her last friend. Denver's still 100 miles north, Xavier observed. Tough journey on foot. Rebecca set her jaw. I've survived worse. Xavier studied her for a long moment. In the firelight, he could see the determination in her amber eyes, the proud set of her shoulders despite her exhaustion. Her dark auburn hair had escaped its pins, falling in waves around a face that showed both refinement and resilience. There's another way, he said finally. I know a man in Salida who might help Judge Thornton. He's retired now, but he still has influence, and more importantly, he's honest. Holloway can't buy him. Rebecca shook her head. Salida's the first place they'll look. Sometimes the best hiding place is in plain sight with the right allies. Xavier reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn silver badge. I was a U.S. Marshal until last year. Still have friends who'd trust my word over Holloway's any day. Hope flickered in Rebecca's eyes, but suspicion quickly followed. Why would you help me? You don't know me. I could be lying about everything. Xavier's mouth curved into a slight smile. Could be, but I've spent 15 years reading people, and I'm betting my horse, who's worth considerably more than me, that you're telling the truth. The smile faded. Besides, I've seen Holloway's type before. Men who think their money gives them the right to take whatever they want. Rebecca stared into the flames, weighing her options. If I go with you to Salida and your judge doesn't help, I'll be walking straight into a noose. True enough, Xavier acknowledged. But if you continue alone, you'll either starve in these mountains or get caught anyway. At least with me, you've got a fighting chance. The fire crackled between them, sparks spiraling into the night sky. After a long silence, Rebecca nodded. I'll go with you to Salida. But at the first sign of trouble, I'm gone. Xavier stood, extending his hand across the fire. Fair enough, Miss Anderson. We'll leave at first light. Rebecca hesitated, then reached out to shake his hand. His grip was firm but gentle, his skin rough with calluses. For the first time in weeks, she felt something besides fear and exhaustion, a flicker of something that might have been hope. Dawn broke over the eastern ridges, painting the sky in strokes of pink and gold. Xavier had been awake for over an hour, checking his gear and saddling his horse. Rebecca emerged from her makeshift shelter of blankets, her face pale but resolute in the early light. We'll need to get you a horse in Granite, Xavier said, handing her a piece of jerky and some dried apples. It's a small mining settlement about 10 miles south of here. Not much more than a general store, a saloon, and a few cabins, but they won't ask questions. Rebecca nodded, accepting the food. How will we explain my presence? A woman traveling alone with a man she's not related to will raise eyebrows. Xavier considered this. Simple enough. You're my widowed cousin, heading to Salida to start fresh after losing your husband in the silver mines. It's a common enough story in these parts. And if someone from Holloway's ranch recognizes me, then we improvise. Xavier's tone was light, but his eyes were serious. But Granite's off the main trails. Chances are slim we'll encounter trouble there. They set off as the sun cleared the mountains, Rebecca riding behind Xavier on his sturdy stallion. The animal seemed unbothered by the extra weight, picking its way confidently along the rocky trail. Xavier kept them off the main paths, following game trails and dry creek beds that only someone intimately familiar with the territory would recognize. As they rode, Xavier pointed out landmarks and shared stories of his years as a marshal. He'd come west from Pennsylvania as a young man, lured by adventure and a sense of justice rather than gold fever. His badge had taken him across Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana territories, hunting outlaws and maintaining what order was possible in the rapidly changing West. "Why did you leave the Marshals?" Rebecca asked as they paused to rest the horse near a small spring. Xavier's expression grew distant. "Lost my partner in a shootout in Laramie. Good man with a wife and 3 kids. After that, the job didn't sit right anymore." He absently stroked the horse's neck. "Took up ranching instead. Got a small spread about 20 miles outside Salida. Nothing fancy, but it's mine." Rebecca recognized the shadow that crossed his face, the same hollow feeling she'd carried since losing her father. "I'm sorry," she said simply. He nodded in acknowledgement, then changed the subject. "Tell me about Boston. Never been east of the Mississippi myself." As they continued their journey, Rebecca found herself sharing stories of her life back east, her mother's death when she was 12. Her years in a ladies' boarding school, her work as a schoolteacher. She described the crowded streets, the elegant buildings, the social constraints that had often felt suffocating. "Father's letters made the West sound so different," she said. "He wrote about the freedom, the open spaces, the chance to build something of your own without society's judgment." Xavier smiled. "There's truth to that. Out here, a person's judged more by their actions than their background, but it's not all freedom and beauty. There's hardship too, and danger. The West forgives mistakes less readily than civilization does." By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking a narrow valley. Below them, a cluster of wooden structures huddled along a winding creek. "Granite. Remember," Xavier said as they prepared to descend, "you're Rebecca Young now, my cousin from Denver. Your husband Michael died in a mining accident 3 months ago. You're still in mourning, which explains why you're quiet around strangers." Rebecca adjusted her shawl, using it to partially obscure her face. "And you're taking me to Salida to help me start a new life." "That's right." "Simple stories are easier to maintain." He studied her for a moment. "Ready?" She took a deep breath and nodded. "Ready." Granite proved to be even smaller than Xavier had described, just a general store with a post office in the back, a saloon that doubled as a boarding house, a livery stable, and perhaps a dozen cabins scattered along the creek. A few men in mining clothes lounged outside the saloon, watching with mild interest as Xavier and Rebecca rode into town. They headed straight for the livery. The stable master, a grizzled man missing 2 fingers on his left hand, emerged from the shadows at the sound of hoofbeats. "Mr. Young," he greeted Xavier with a nod. "Didn't expect to see you in these parts." "Passing through Sila's," Xavier replied, dismounting and helping Rebecca down. "Need a horse for my cousin here, something gentle but with some endurance." Silas's eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed Rebecca. "Madam," he said with a respectful tip of his hat, "might have just the thing. Got a bay mare, came in last week with a trader. Good temperament, strong legs." While Xavier negotiated with Silas, Rebecca waited near the entrance, keeping her face turned away from the main street. Her heart nearly stopped when she spotted 2 riders approaching from the south, men wearing the distinct crossed arrow brand of the Holloway Ranch on their vests. "Xavier," she murmured urgently. He followed her gaze, his expression remaining neutral even as his body tensed. "Stay calm," he said quietly. "Silas will take the mare, and we could use some supplies if you're willing to point us toward the general store." Silas, oblivious to the tension, nodded toward a building across the street. Hank's place has everything you'll need. Tell him I sent you. He might knock a few cents off. The Holloway men had dismounted outside the saloon, tying their horses to the hitching post. They hadn't looked toward the livery yet, but it would only be a matter of time. Xavier moved casually between Rebecca and the street, guiding her toward the mare's stall. "Let's get you acquainted with your new horse," he said loudly enough for Silas to hear. Lowering his voice, he added, "If they come this way, let me do the talking. And remember, you're grieving, keep your head down." Rebecca nodded, her mouth dry with fear. She focused on the mare, a pretty bay with a white star on her forehead. The animal regarded her with intelligent eyes, nudging Rebecca's hand curiously. "She likes you," Silas observed, bringing a saddle. "That's a good sign." Xavier helped saddle the mare while Rebecca stroked her neck, keeping her back to the entrance. She could hear voices outside growing louder. The Holloway men were approaching. "Silas, you seen a woman come through here? Auburn hair, traveling alone." The voice was rough, impatient. Rebecca's blood froze, but she continued petting the horse, her movements deliberately slow and sad. "Nobody like that," Silas replied. "Only folks I've seen today are Mr. Young and his widowed cousin. They're just in the back there." Heavy footsteps approached. Rebecca kept her face down, allowing her shawl to obscure her profile. She felt Xavier move slightly closer to her, his hand casually near his holstered revolver. "Afternoon, gentlemen," Xavier said pleasantly. "Something I can help you with?" "Looking for a woman," the first man replied. "Murderess escaped from Gunnison. Red hair, pretty face. Dangerous." "Haven't seen anyone matching that description," Xavier said. "My cousin and I came in from the north. Been quiet all morning." Rebecca felt eyes on her and hunched her shoulders further, as if overwhelmed by grief. The mare sensed her tension and shifted restlessly. "Who's she?" the second man asked, suspicion evident in his voice. "My cousin Rebecca," Xavier answered smoothly. "Lost her husband in the mines a few months back. I'm taking her to Salida to stay with family." A long, tense silence followed. Rebecca could feel sweat trickling down her back despite the cool air in the stable. "Madam," the first man said. "Mind looking up for a moment?" Xavier stepped forward. "My cousin's in mourning, sir. Hasn't been talking much, even to me. I'd appreciate some consideration." Rebecca heard the subtle change in his voice, still polite, but with an undercurrent of steel that suggested further pressing would not be wise. She kept her face down, her hand steady on the mare's neck through sheer force of will. The tension in the stable was thick enough to cut when Silas unexpectedly intervened. "Say, aren't you Holloway's boys? Tell your boss his order of nails and wires come in at Hank's. Been sitting there almost a week." The distraction worked. After a moment, the first man grunted. "We'll let him know." To Xavier, he added, "Sorry for the trouble, we'll be moving on." "No trouble," Xavier replied evenly. "Hope you find who you're looking for." The footsteps receded. Rebecca didn't move until Xavier touched her arm gently. "They're gone, but we should leave quickly." Within 15 minutes, they had paid Silas, purchased basic supplies from the general store, and were riding north out of Granite, but not before Xavier made sure they were seen heading in that direction by several townspeople. Once out of sight of the settlement, he led them east through a narrow canyon, then doubled back southwest on a trail so faint Rebecca could barely discern it. "Holloway's men will hear we went north," Xavier explained as they pushed through dense pine forest. "By the time they figure out we doubled back, we'll be halfway to Salida by a route they won't expect." The trail Xavier chose was grueling steep switchbacks up rocky slopes, narrow paths along sheer cliff faces, and dense forest where branches clawed at their clothing. But it kept them hidden from the main trails where Holloway's men might be watching. They rode hard through the afternoon, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and drink from clear mountain streams. As dusk approached, Xavier led them into a small box canyon invisible from the surrounding area. A crude lean-to stood against one wall with a stone fire ring nearby. "Old hunting camp," he explained as they dismounted. "Used it many times over the years. We'll be safe here for the night." Rebecca's body ached from the long hours of riding. She moved stiffly as she helped Xavier unsaddle the horses and set up camp. Despite her exhaustion, she felt a growing respect for her companion. His skill in the wilderness, his calm handling of the Holloway men, and his unwavering focus on keeping her safe spoke of a man with both capability and character. As darkness fell, Xavier built a small, nearly smokeless fire and prepared a simple meal of bacon, beans, and coffee. They ate in comfortable silence, the day's tension gradually easing from their shoulders. "Thank you," Rebecca said finally, setting aside her empty plate, "for what you did in Granite. Those men would have recognized me if you hadn't intervened." Xavier shrugged. "You'd have done the same." "I'm not sure I would have known how," she admitted. "I've spent my life in cities and classrooms. This world, your world, is foreign to me." "You're adapting quickly," Xavier observed. "Most Easterners would have broken down after what you've been through." Rebecca stared into the fire. "I don't have the luxury of breaking down, not until I clear my name and reclaim my father's land." Xavier added a small log to the fire, sparks rising like fireflies into the night. "Tell me more about your father. What kind of man was he?" For the next hour, Rebecca shared stories of Jonathan Anderson, his kindness, his adventurous spirit, his determination to build something lasting in the West. As she spoke, the grief she'd been holding at bay finally surfaced. Her voice faltered, and tears she'd been too frightened to shed now flowed freely. "I'm sorry," she whispered, wiping her eyes. "I haven't had time to properly mourn him." Xavier didn't offer platitudes or awkward comfort. Instead, he simply listened, allowing her the dignity of her grief. When she finally fell silent, emotionally spent, he spoke quietly. "Sounds like a good man, the kind the West needs more of." After a pause, he added, "And it sounds like he raised a daughter with the same strength." Rebecca looked up, surprised by the genuine admiration in his voice. In the flickering light, she studied his face, the strong jawline softened by compassion, the clear blue eyes that missed nothing but judged little. For the first time since her father's death, she felt truly seen by another person. "We should try to sleep," Xavier said, seeming almost embarrassed by the moment of connection. "Tomorrow will be another long day." He arranged their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire, maintaining a respectful distance. As Rebecca settled beneath her blankets, exhaustion quickly overtaking her, she heard Xavier's quiet voice once more. "You don't have to keep fighting alone, Rebecca. Not anymore." The promise in those simple words followed her into sleep, a comfort against the uncertainty that lay ahead. They reached Salida shortly before sunset the next day, approaching from the west to avoid the main roads. The town had grown significantly since Rebecca had last visited. New buildings lined the streets, and the railroad depot bustled with activity. The Arkansas River glinted in the distance, a silver ribbon cutting through the valley. Xavier led them to a modest house on the outskirts of town. "Judge Thornton's place," he explained as they dismounted. "Best to come here directly rather than risk being seen in town." The house was well maintained, with a wide porch and carefully tended flower beds. A tall, silver-haired man appeared in the doorway before they reached the steps, his keen eyes taking in their dusty appearance and the wariness in Rebecca's stance. "Xavier Young," he said, his voice deep and measured. "It's been a while." "Judge Thornton," Xavier greeted him with a nod. "Sorry to arrive unannounced. We need your help and discretion." The judge's gaze shifted to Rebecca. "I assume this has something to do with the wanted posters that came through yesterday. Murder charge against a Miss Rebecca Anderson." Rebecca paled, but Xavier stepped forward. "It's not what it seems. She deserves a fair hearing at the very least." Judge Thornton studied them for a long moment, then stepped aside. "You'd better come in, then. Margaret's visiting her sister in Denver, so we can speak freely." Inside, the house was comfortable but not lavish, with well-worn furniture and bookshelves lining every wall. The judge ushered them into his study and closed the door firmly behind them. "Now," he said, settling into a leather chair, "tell me everything and don't leave anything out. I can't help if I don't have all the facts." For the next hour, Rebecca recounted her story: her father's suspicious death, Holloway's land grab, the discovery of the foreman's body, and the watch that linked everything together. Xavier occasionally added details about their journey and the encounter with Holloway's men in Granite. When they finished, Judge Thornton remained silent for several minutes, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. Finally, he sighed heavily. "I believe you, Miss Anderson. Vincent Holloway has been skirting the law for years, but he's careful, always keeps his own hands clean." He rose and paced to the window. "But believing you and proving your innocence are two very different matters." "Then I have no hope?" Rebecca asked, her voice small. "I didn't say that," the judge replied. "There are still honest men in the territorial government. And I have some influence with the circuit judge who would hear your case." He turned back to face them. "What we need is evidence, something that proves Holloway's involvement in both your father's death and his foreman's murder." Xavier leaned forward. "The watch is key. If we could establish how Grady got it, and why he had it with him that day," Rebecca added. "He must have been careless, or perhaps he was meeting someone." Judge Thornton nodded thoughtfully. "We need to investigate without alerting Holloway. He has eyes all over Salida." He considered for a moment. "First, we need to keep you hidden, Miss Anderson. I have a hunting cabin about 5 miles from here. It's remote, comfortable enough, and few people know of its existence." "I'll stay with her," Xavier said immediately, "for protection." The judge raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on Xavier's protective instinct. "Good. Meanwhile, I'll make some inquiries about Grady's movements before his death. The saloon girls often know more than people realize." "There's something else," Rebecca said hesitantly. "My father kept detailed journals. I brought them with me when I fled, but I had to abandon my saddlebags when my horse went lame. I left them hidden in a hollow tree about 2 miles from the Wilson homestead. Those journals might contain information about Holloway's interest in your land," the judge mused. "Worth retrieving if possible." Xavier nodded. "I can go tomorrow. The Wilsons know me. They won't ask questions." They spent another hour planning their next steps before the judge insisted they eat and rest. After a simple but hearty meal, he drove them to the cabin in his buggy, taking a circuitous route to ensure they weren't followed. The cabin was small but sturdy, with a main room containing a stone fireplace, a table with 4 chairs, and a small kitchen area. A narrow hallway led to 2 small bedrooms. While rustic, it was clean and well provisioned. "I come here to fish and escape Margaret's social obligations," the judge explained with a wry smile. "There's enough food to last a week, and the well has clean water." He handed Xavier a key. "Lock up when I leave. I'll return in 3 days with whatever information I can gather." After the judge departed, an awkward silence fell between Rebecca and Xavier. The small cabin suddenly seemed very intimate for 2 virtual strangers. "You should take the larger bedroom," Xavier said finally, setting their saddlebags on the table. "I'll take the one off the kitchen." Rebecca nodded gratefully. "Thank you for everything. I know you've put yourself at considerable risk for someone you barely know." Xavier's expression softened. "Some things are worth the risk." He cleared his throat. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow I'll ride out to retrieve your father's journals." That night, as Rebecca lay in the unfamiliar bed listening to the sounds of the forest outside, she found her thoughts continuously returning to Xavier. In just 2 days, this quiet, capable man had become her protector, her ally, and perhaps her friend. There was something about him, a steadiness, an innate decency that made her feel safe for the first time in months. She wondered about his life before they met, about the losses he'd hinted at but never fully explained. What had shaped him into the man who would risk everything to help a stranger? And why did her heart beat faster whenever their eyes met? Sleep came slowly, filled with dreams of danger and pursuit, but also of strong hands pulling her to safety and blue eyes that promised she wasn't alone anymore. Dawn broke clear and cold. Rebecca awoke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly in the clothes Judge Thornton's wife had left for her, a simple blue skirt and white blouse that fit well enough, and emerged to find Xavier at the small stove. "Hope I didn't wake you," he said, glancing up. "Thought I'd get an early start to the Wilson place." "You didn't wake me," she assured him, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "Are you sure it's safe for you to go alone?" Xavier nodded. "Safer than bringing you closer to where they'll be looking. Besides, I can move faster on my own." He hesitated, then added, "But I don't like leaving you here unprotected." Rebecca straightened her shoulders. "I'm not entirely helpless. My father taught me to shoot before he came west." She patted the pocket of her skirt where she still carried the small derringer. "It's not much, but it's something." Xavier smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes and transformed his solemn face. "I don't doubt your courage for a moment, Miss Anderson. Still, keep the doors locked and stay inside. Judge Thornton left a rifle in the closet if you need it." They ate breakfast together, discussing what might be in Jonathan Anderson's journals that could help their case. Afterward, Xavier prepared to leave, checking his revolver and packing supplies for the journey. At the door, he paused, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. "I should be back by nightfall if I'm not." He trailed off. "You will be," Rebecca said firmly, surprising herself by reaching out to touch his arm. "Be careful, Xavier." He covered her hand with his own for just a moment, the brief contact sending warmth through her despite the morning chill. "Lock the door behind me," he said quietly, then was gone. The hours stretched endlessly as Rebecca waited. She tried to keep busy, organizing supplies, reading one of the judge's books, even attempting to mend a tear in her travel-worn dress. But her thoughts kept returning to Xavier, imagining all manner of disasters that might befall him. By late afternoon, clouds had gathered over the mountains, and a steady rain began to fall. Rebecca paced anxiously, peering out the windows for any sign of Xavier's return. When darkness fell with no sign of him, her worry deepened to fear. She built up the fire against the growing chill and prepared a simple stew, more to occupy her hands than from any real appetite. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the roof and windows. It was nearly midnight when she heard hoofbeats approaching through the storm. Grabbing the rifle from the closet, Rebecca positioned herself beside the door, heart pounding. A knock came, followed by Xavier's voice, strained but unmistakable. "Rebecca, it's me." She flung open the door to find him drenched and muddy, one arm held stiffly against his side. Relief flooded her, quickly followed by alarm as she noticed the darkness staining his shirt beneath his rain-soaked coat. "You're hurt," she gasped, helping him inside. "It's not bad," he grimaced, sinking onto a chair by the fire. "Bullet grazed my side, lost some blood, but nothing vital was hit." Rebecca locked the door and hurried to his side. "What happened? Did you find the journals?" Xavier nodded, patting the saddlebag he dropped by the door. "Got them." But Holloway's men were watching the Wilson place. Managed to get away, but not before one of them got lucky with a shot. He attempted a reassuring smile that turned into a wince. "Rode the long way back to make sure I wasn't followed." Rebecca was already gathering clean cloths and water. "Take off your shirt. I need to see how bad it is." Xavier complied with obvious discomfort, revealing a lean, muscled torso and a bloody furrow along his left side just above the waist. Rebecca worked methodically, cleaning the wound with water and whiskey from the judge's supply, then binding it with strips of clean cloth. "You've done this before," Xavier observed, watching her capable movements. "I volunteered at a hospital in Boston during the war," she explained, securing the bandage. "Saw far worse than this, though it's been some years." When she finished, Xavier caught her hand, his fingers warm despite his ordeal. "Thank you." Rebecca became acutely aware of their proximity, of her hand in his, of his bare chest rising and falling with each breath. Color rose to her cheeks, and she gently withdrew her hand. "You should rest. I'll make you something to eat." While Xavier changed into dry clothes, Rebecca heated the stew she'd prepared earlier. They ate in companionable silence, the tension of the day gradually easing as the fire crackled cheerfully against the storm outside. "Did you read the journals?" Rebecca asked finally, collecting their empty bowls. Xavier shook his head. "Thought we should look through them together." The journal's 5 leather-bound books spanning the years since Jonathan Anderson had arrived in Colorado territory were carefully wrapped in oilcloth, protected from the rain. Rebecca handled them reverently, running her fingers over her father's familiar handwriting. They spent the next several hours poring over the pages, looking for any mention of Holloway or discrepancies in the land boundaries. Near dawn, in the final journal, they found what they were seeking. "Look at this," Rebecca said excitedly, pointing to an entry dated 3 weeks before her father's death. "He writes about discovering a survey marker that had been moved on the north property line, the boundary with Holloway's ranch." Xavier leaned closer, reading over her shoulder. "And the next page he confronted Holloway about it, and Holloway threatened him." Rebecca turned the page. "Here, 2 days before he died, Grady came by today with an offer from Holloway $5,000 for the north section. Claims they've found silver traces on their side, likely extending onto my land. Offered to show me the assay reports tomorrow. Something doesn't feel right about this." Xavier's expression darkened. "That's the last entry before his death," Rebecca nodded, turning the page to find it blank. "The accident happened before he could meet with Grady again." Her voice trembled with anger and grief. "They killed him for that land." Xavier gently took the journal from her hands. "And this is the evidence we need. Your father documented Holloway's interest in the land, the boundary dispute, and a meeting with Grady scheduled right before his death." He pointed to an earlier entry. "He even mentions here that his watch was a gift from your mother and he always wore it. That explains why Grady had it." Rebecca closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the confirmation of what she'd suspected all along. "Holloway had my father killed for silver, then framed me when I started asking questions. The judge will know what to do with this information," Xavier assured her. "We just need to wait for him to return." But as dawn broke, bringing clear skies after the storm, their momentary triumph was shattered by the sound of approaching riders, multiple horses moving deliberately toward the cabin. Xavier was on his feet instantly, pain forgotten as he moved to the window. "3 riders," he reported grimly, "and they're not trying to be quiet." "Holloway's men?" Rebecca asked, gathering the journals with shaking hands. "Most likely." Xavier checked his revolver. They must have followed me after all, waited out the storm before moving in. What do we do? Rebecca's mind raced through their limited options. Xavier's expression was resolute. We need those journals to reach Judge Thornton. There's a cellar trapdoor in the kitchen. Leads to a root cellar with an exit that comes out about 50 yards behind the cabin, hidden in some bushes. Rebecca understood immediately. I'll take the journals to the judge. Xavier shook his head. Too dangerous. I'll create a diversion, draw them away from the cabin. You wait in the cellar until it's clear, then take the journals to town. No, Rebecca protested. You're injured, they'll kill you. I know these mountains, Xavier insisted. I can lose them. The riders were close now, their voices carrying on the morning air. They had little time to argue. Trust me, Rebecca, Xavier said, his eyes holding hers. In one swift movement he pulled her to him, his lips meeting hers in a brief but fervent kiss. For luck, he murmured as he pulled away. Stunned by the unexpected kiss, Rebecca could only nod as Xavier helped her into the cellar, the precious journals clutched to her chest. Wait at least 10 minutes after the shooting stops, he instructed, handing her his spare revolver. Then go straight to town. Don't look back. Before she could respond, he closed the trapdoor, leaving her in darkness save for thin streams of light filtering through cracks in the wooden ceiling. Rebecca moved to the far end of the cellar, where a narrow tunnel, barely big enough to crawl through, led to freedom. Above, she heard Xavier open the front door, his voice carrying clearly. "Morning, gentlemen. Bit early for social calls," a gruff voice responded. "Xavier Young. Should have known you'd be mixed up in this. Where's the Anderson woman?" "Gone," Xavier replied calmly. "Headed for Denver with evidence that will hang Holloway for murder. You boys might want to consider which side you're on before this is over." Laughter, followed by the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked. "Nice try. Search the cabin, Tom." Rebecca held her breath, praying they wouldn't find the trapdoor. Footsteps moved across the floor above her head, then a sudden burst of gunfire erupted. She bit back a cry, straining to hear what was happening. More shots, the sound of breaking glass, then hoofbeats moving away from the cabin. Xavier had managed to draw them off as planned. Rebecca counted slowly to 600, each second an agony of uncertainty. When she finally emerged from the cellar through the hidden exit, the forest was quiet except for birdsong. The cabin stood empty, a broken window and bullet holes in the door the only evidence of the confrontation. There was no time to waste. Rebecca gathered supplies, saddled the mare Xavier had bought her in Granite, and secured the journals in the saddlebag. As she prepared to leave, she noticed a folded paper on the table that hadn't been there before, a hastily scrawled note in Xavier's handwriting. "Rebecca, if anything happens to me, take the trail east through Aspen Creek. Safer than the main road. Judge Thornton will know what to do with the journals. You don't have to keep fighting alone." Tears burned in her eyes as she tucked the note into her pocket. Then, steeling herself for whatever lay ahead, Rebecca mounted the mare and rode east toward Salida. The journey to town was tense but uneventful. Rebecca avoided the main roads as Xavier had instructed, following game trails and dry creek beds. By mid-afternoon, she reached Judge Thornton's house, nearly collapsing with relief when she saw his buggy in the yard. The judge's face registered shock when he opened the door to find her alone and obviously distraught. "Miss Anderson, where's Xavier? What's happened?" Rebecca quickly explained the night's discoveries and the morning's confrontation as the judge ushered her inside. She handed over the journals with trembling hands. "Xavier drew them away so I could escape with these. I don't know if he—" Her voice broke. Judge Thornton scanned the crucial entries, his expression grim. "This changes everything." These journals, combined with the information I've gathered in town, are enough to request an official investigation." He looked up at Rebecca's pale face. "But first, we need to find Xavier." "You've heard nothing from him?" Rebecca asked, hope fading. "Nothing. But Xavier knows how to handle himself." The judge patted her hand. "My deputy marshal friend is in town. We'll organize a search party immediately." While the judge sent messages to trusted allies, Rebecca paced anxiously, unable to rest despite her exhaustion. Every minute that passed without word of Xavier deepened her fear and clarified her feelings. In just a few days, this man had become essential to her in ways she hadn't thought possible. The search party departed as dusk approached, leaving Rebecca behind despite her protests. "You'll help Xavier most by staying safe," the judge insisted. "If Holloway learns you're in town, we'll have 2 people to rescue instead of 1. Left alone in the judge's house, Rebecca finally succumbed to exhaustion, falling into a troubled sleep on the parlor sofa. She dreamed of gunfire and pursuit, of Xavier calling her name as he disappeared into darkness. She awoke to the sound of voices in the front yard. Dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the curtains. Rebecca rushed to the window to see the search party returning, and in their midst, supported between 2 men but very much alive, was Xavier. Rebecca flung open the front door, propriety forgotten as she ran to meet them. Xavier looked up at her approach, his face bruised and dirt-streaked, but his eyes lighting with relief and something deeper at the sight of her. "Found him about 5 miles west of the cabin," the deputy marshal explained as they helped Xavier inside. "Horse was shot out from under him, and he took a bad fall down a ravine. Couple of broken ribs and a nasty gash on his leg, but he'll live." "Holloway's men?" Rebecca asked anxiously as they settled Xavier on the sofa. "Lost them in the mountains," Xavier said, his voice hoarse but steady. "They're probably still looking in the wrong direction." He reached for Rebecca's hand. "You made it. The journals, safe with the judge," she assured him, fighting back tears of relief. "He says they're enough to request an official investigation." Judge Thornton entered with hot coffee and bandages. "More than that," he said. "While you 2 were playing cat and mouse with Holloway's men, I was gathering testimonies in town. The bartender at the Silver Dollar remembers Grady bragging about coming into money the night before Jonathan Anderson's death. And I found a stable boy who overheard Grady and Holloway arguing about a watch the day before Grady was killed." He set the coffee down and fixed them with a determined look. "I've already wired the territorial governor. He's sending a special investigator from Denver. Holloway won't wriggle out of this one." The following week passed in a blur of statements and legal proceedings. The special investigator arrived from Denver, armed with the authority to arrest Holloway pending a full investigation. With the journals, witness testimonies, and the recovered watch as evidence, Holloway's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Further investigation revealed that the silver vein Holloway coveted extended primarily under Anderson land, potentially worth a fortune. Grady had apparently grown nervous about his role in Jonathan's death, and had kept the watch as insurance, a fatal mistake that ultimately exposed the entire scheme. Throughout the proceedings, Xavier remained by Rebecca's side, his steady presence a comfort against the storm of public attention and legal complexities. His injuries healed slowly, but his determination never wavered. Finally, 10 days after their desperate flight from the hunting cabin, Judge Thornton brought the news they'd been waiting for. Holloway was being charged with 2 counts of murder, with his trial set for the following month in Denver. The charges against Rebecca had been formally dropped, and her father's land would be returned to her possession. That evening, Rebecca sat on the judge's porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and crimson. The weight that had pressed on her shoulders for months had finally lifted, leaving her oddly uncertain about what came next. Xavier joined her, moving more easily now as his ribs healed. "Penny for your thoughts," he said, settling into the chair beside her. Rebecca smiled. "I was just thinking about how quickly life can change. A few weeks ago, I was running for my life. Now I'm free with my father's land restored and his killers facing justice." She turned to face him. "None of it would have happened without you." Xavier shook his head. "You would have found a way." "You're stronger than you realize." "Perhaps," she acknowledged, "but I'm glad I didn't have to do it alone." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been on her mind. "What will you do now? Return to your ranch?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the distant mountains. "My ranch has been running itself without me these past weeks. Might continue that way for a while." He looked at her, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. "Unless you have need of an experienced rancher to help restore your father's property. It's been neglected under Holloway's watch." Rebecca's heart quickened. "Are you offering your services, Mr. Young?" "I'm offering more than that, Miss Anderson." Xavier took her hand, his thumb tracing gentle circles on her palm. "These past weeks have shown me something I didn't expect to find again, someone worth changing my solitary ways for." The sincerity in his blue eyes took Rebecca's breath away. "I've come to care for you, Rebecca," he continued. "More than I thought possible in such a short time. And if you'll allow it, I'd like to court you properly. No more running, no more hiding, just a man and a woman seeing where this path might lead." Rebecca felt tears of happiness spring to her eyes. The connection between them, forged in danger and strengthened by shared purpose, had grown into something neither had anticipated but both now treasured. "I'd like that very much," she whispered, leaning closer. "After all, you did promise I wouldn't have to keep fighting alone." Xavier's smile was radiant as he closed the distance between them, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that held all the promise of beginnings rather than endings. In his arms, Rebecca found not just safety, but belonging, a feeling of coming home that had nothing to do with land or buildings and everything to do with the heart. 1 year later, wildflowers carpeted the rolling pastures of the Young ranch. Under Rebecca and Xavier's combined efforts, the property had been transformed, fences repaired, cattle herds restored, and a new wing added to the ranch house. The silver vein that Holloway had coveted now provided a comfortable income that allowed them to employ several local families and contribute generously to Salada's growing community. On a perfect June evening, Rebecca stood on the porch of their home, watching as Xavier returned from checking the north pasture. The sight of him still made her heart beat faster, his tall figure silhouetted against the sunset, hat tipped back to reveal the face she had come to love with every fiber of her being. They had married in Judge Thornton's parlor 6 months earlier, a simple ceremony attended by the few people who had stood by them during their darkest days. Xavier had moved his small herd to join with Rebecca's inherited cattle, their separate lives merging as seamlessly as their hearts had. As she watched her husband approach, Rebecca's hand drifted to her abdomen, where the first subtle signs of new life had begun to make themselves known. She hadn't told Xavier yet, wanting to be certain before sharing the joyous news. He dismounted with the easy grace that always captivated her, leading his horse to the water trough before climbing the porch steps. His smile when he saw her waiting was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Beautiful evening," he remarked, removing his hat and hanging it on the peg by the door. Rebecca nodded, moving into the circle of his arms. "Perfect for some news I've been waiting to share." Xavier raised an eyebrow, his arms tightening slightly around her waist. "Good news, I hope." "The very best," Rebecca replied, taking his hand and placing it gently over her stomach. "We'll be welcoming a new rancher around Christmas time." Xavier's expression transformed from confusion to wonder in an instant. "A baby, you're certain?" Rebecca nodded, laughing at his astonished joy. "Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. We're going to be parents, Xavier." With a whoop that startled the horses in the corral, Xavier lifted her off her feet in a careful embrace, his face alight with happiness. "A family," he marveled, setting her gently back on her feet. "Our family." As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, they built a small fire in the pit Xavier had constructed in their yard, a place to gather, to remember, to dream of the future. Sitting beside it, wrapped in her husband's strong arms, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever think about that night we met?" she asked, watching the flames dance in the gathering darkness. "When I was at my lowest point, crying beside that dying fire." Xavier nodded, his cheek resting against her hair. "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever seen, facing impossible odds, refusing to give up even when all seemed lost." Rebecca turned to face him, cupping his beloved face in her hands. "You said something that night that changed everything for me. You said I didn't have to keep fighting alone." "And you never will," Xavier promised, covering her hands with his own. "Not as long as I'm breathing." As their lips met in a tender kiss, the fire crackled warmly beside them, no longer a symbol of desperation and fear, but of home and hope, a beacon lighting their way into a future they would face together, with the strength that comes from loving and being loved in return. In the years that followed, the Young Ranch prospered, becoming known throughout Colorado Territory for its fine cattle and the generosity of its owners. Their son, Thomas Jonathan Young, arrived on Christmas Eve as predicted, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Elizabeth Margaret. The family grew alongside their legacy, building something that went beyond land and wealth, a testament to the healing power of love and the strength found in facing life's challenges together rather than alone. And on summer evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep, Rebecca and Xavier would often sit beside their fire, hands intertwined, watching the stars emerge above the mountains that had witnessed both their darkest hour and their greatest joy. In those quiet moments, they found the peace that comes from knowing whatever fires might die, whatever challenges might arise, they would face them as they had from the beginning, side by side, together.